Hello, I'm Alice Hutchinson, the owner of Birds Books, an independent bookstore in Bethel, Connecticut, and I'm honored to be the host of Write America. The aim of this series is to help set the country back on a correct, productive course of freedom, justice, equality, and plain human kindness. Write America is a literary series created by author Roger Rosenblatt, featuring award-winning, nationally renowned authors and new and emerging writers in readings and conversations each week about how books and art might bridge the deep divisions in our nation. Write America celebrates the quiet power of art in our lives, the unifying power of the highest uses of language. In novels, stories, essays, and poems, we recognize one another as parts of the human family, one family. Roger Rosenblatt, the creator of Write America, put it this way: writing makes justice desirable, evil intelligible, grief endurable, and love possible. So with that, I welcome you. And please join us every Monday evening at this time as many of the most beloved and distinguished writers in the country read from their works and talk to each other and with you in an effort to bring us together. If you missed our last week's episode with Meg Wolitzer and Delia Ephron or any of the previous episodes of Write America, you can go to Birds Books Crowdcast channel and watch the recordings at any time. Tonight's episode is also being recorded, so if you missed something, you can go back and rewatch. Tonight, Birds Books hosts readings by and conversation with Deborah and James Fallows. I will return at the end after the readings and discussion to bring your questions and comments to the authors. For those of you unfamiliar with Crowdcast, many of you have discovered the chat to the right of your screen, and feel free to comment there. If you have a question, however, you look at the bottom of your screen and you'll see an Ask a Question tab. That's where I will go to look for your questions for the authors. The green link at the bottom of the page is a link to this episode on the Birds Books website, where you can purchase the author's books while supporting the bookstore and Write America. Our first speaker is Deborah Fallows. Deborah Fallows is a writer and linguist. She has written extensively on language, education, families, and work, China, and travel for The Atlantic, National Geographic, Slate, the New York Times, the LA Times, the Washington Monthly, the Washington Post, and other publications. She's been a fellow at New America and a senior research fellow at the Pew Research Center. For 4 years, Deborah and her husband, writer James Fallows, crisscrossed the country in their small plane, reporting for The Atlantic on the civic and economic renewal of America's towns. Their book about the project, Our Towns, a 100,000-mile journey to the heart of America, was a New York Times bestseller and published in May of 2018. The HBO documentary, Our Towns, based on the book, was released in April 2021. These are the basis for Our Towns Civic Foundation, launched in April 2021. Deborah has served as a director of data architecture for Oxygen Media. Previously, she was assistant dean and assistant director of admissions at Georgetown University. Her 2010 book, Dreaming in Chinese, Mandarin Lessons in Life, Love, and Language, is based on a 3-year experience living and working in China. She earned a BA from Harvard College and a PhD in linguistics from the University of Texas. Deborah Fallows and her husband live in D.C., and they have 2 married sons and 5 grandchildren. Please welcome to the screen, Deborah Fallows.
Alice, thank you so much. Jim and I are going to be delighted to be here. We're very honored to have been invited. Thanks to Alice, thanks to Birds Books, and special thanks to Roger Rosenblatt and Ginny Rosenblatt, who've been friends of Jim's and mine for well over half our lives. So we couldn't be happier than to be here. I'm going to read first from one of our favorite towns during our 100,000-mile journey, which is Sioux Falls, South Dakota. Sioux Falls, many of you may know if you've had call center interactions on the phone, because most of them originate in South Dakota, in Sioux Falls. We saw it from a very different perspective. And it was one of our favorite towns because it was so surprising to see how this Scandinavian Germanic heritage town welcomed the immigrant and refugee population embedded it into its culture and its town, and what it did for that, and the example that it sets for America. So I'm going to read you a little bit about Sioux Falls. We weren't surprised to find that Sioux Falls had become the move-to town for aspiring residents of many South Dakota rural towns. What we hadn't expected was the great number of people in another group, those who were instantly distinguishable from South Dakotans of Germanic and Scandinavian heritage. These are the foreigners of so many different colors and ethnic groups. Beginning in the 1970s, Sioux Falls welcomed wave after wave of refugees. The city is well known in the refugee and migrant community for having a strong, supportive system. The population is large and diverse. Take the school system as a proxy. Nearly 10% of the students in Sioux Falls Public Schools are designated as English language learner students. These are native speakers of some 60 different languages. 60. Can you even name 60 languages? When the Sioux Falls Public Schools opened their doors in 2013, the biggest single group of these students, about 1/3 of the total, were 700 Spanish speakers, many of whom had arrived in migrant worker families. As for the other 2/3, when we visited, there were about 259 Nepali speakers, 135 who spoke Arabic, 129 Swahili, 101 Somali, 93 Amharic, 84 Tigrinya, and 77 French. A very long tail of other languages included many I'd never heard of. And even though I'd been studying languages and linguistics my entire life, Maimai had 27 speakers in the city, Nuer had 7, and Graybo and Lingala, and the list goes on. The Jane Addams Elementary School is an immersion school for the newly arrived non-English speaking children. The students can stay in the program for up to 2 years before integrating into mainstream schools. It's a part of the strong, textured Sioux Falls infrastructure of support, from health services to jobs to churches to housing to sports. The school program started in the classroom and extend to tutoring, summer school, free lunches, and bus passes. They also look at whole family success. Home to school liaisons do things like help schedule parent-teacher conferences and they round up translators. Some translation involves what reminded us of those children's games of telephone, where speakers pass on a message from one language to the next, and the next, and the next, and then back again. Such details are fundamental to keeping the entire system working. The refugees and those who work with them told me about some of the cultural differences that they face. Gender. Many of the immigrants come from countries and cultures where education for girls is an afterthought. Arriving in the States, girls lag far behind in their school experience or may be starting for fresh the first time, no matter what their age. The academic and social cost to girls is obvious. Boys often have another advantage, in a word, soccer. Being a good athlete translates into many advantages, starting with positive attention from teammates, classrooms, coaches, and fans. Birthdays. Many refugee kids share January 1st as their birthday. Coincidence? A mother of 10 from one refugee family told me if she, instead of her husband, had been the one to answer questions during the blur of their final entry paperwork, she would have provided the proper birth dates. The default was January 1st. Lunch. Many students told me that because their sketchy schooling in refugee camps in their native countries, or being just on the move for many years, they aren't competitive enough academically to get into the classes with the, quote, American kids, as they call them. That leaves lunch as a potential hangout times to mix and mingle. They also said that while friendships at least have a chance to start at lunch, they usually also end at lunch. After school jobs, transportation issues, and the preferences of some families to keep their children close can complicate the after-school social scenes for newly arrived kids. I heard from coaches who would personally drive some of their immigrant athletes to and from practices so they could be part of the team. Being Muslim. Administrators noticed that it seemed particularly cruel for fasting students to sit idly in the cafeteria during Ramadan while everyone else was eating. To address that, the school provided a place for those students to spend that time. The basics. Where do you start acculturation with the with the ocean-deep discrepancies among the children. In refugee-rich Burlington, Vermont, one school's population includes the daughter of the principal and a little boy whose life experience is so raw that he pees in the corner of the classroom because he can't imagine a toilet in a restroom. Reaching for dreams. A refugee from Darfur, a high school sophomore, told me with pride that she joined the junior ROTC at her school. She said she liked the history lessons and the activities and the programs provided. A big disappointment, however, she said, was not being allowed to wear her hijab along with her ROTC uniform to school on dress day. She would have to choose. It was beyond me from my adult perspective that this girl's preoccupation was, at 16 years old, her apparel conflict. She had been through more tragedy and miracle by the time she was 6 years old than most of us will experience in a lifetime. When Muslims fled Darfur on foot across the Sudan to escape death, she was separated from her family and lost in the chaos of war at 6 years old. Later, in a miracle of odds that expunged her bad fortune, she was reunited with her family in a refugee camp. I heard some months later that the ROTC officials at her school had appealed her case all the way to the top, and she was allowed to dress as she wished on formal dress day. All right, then, I'm going to read you one more, which is, this is about public libraries, which I'm sure all of you are great fans of. And this is a story from Bend, Oregon, another favorite city of ours, and how libraries have changed every aspect of their being to fit into and serve their communities. As part of their research into the community libraries' uses and needs, the administration of the Deschutes Public Library system in Bend filmed several Q&A sessions with residents about their library. For Todd Dunkelberg, the director of the 6-branch Deschutes Library System, the results were a wake-up call about the library's visibility and people's familiarity with it. People felt guilty not knowing about their library, he admitted to me. That was a sentiment I heard from lots of librarians I met, who lamented that their libraries were, quote, the best kept secret in town. This connection to community, the third sturdy leg that stood besides technology and education, where libraries engaged to serve the people, was foundational in the Bend Library. In 2010, Dunkelberg and the Deschutes librarians set out to do something about it. The librarians assumed new titles. They were called community librarians, and they headed out to embed themselves in local groups and organizations carrying the message of the resourceful and activity-rich library. They also wanted to see how they might build partnerships for the community, for the good of the community. At first, Dunkelberg said, the librarians met with a puzzled reaction. Why are you here? But after a few years of listening, learning, and sharing stories and collaborating, people would see the librarians coming and ask them, how can we work with you? Bend was pulling a paragraph straight from Tocqueville's observations from his classic reporting trip around America. In Democracy in America, Tocqueville waxed on in astonishment at how many associations Americans made for anything and everything. Americans of all ages, all stations in life, and all types of dispositions are forever forming associations, he wrote, of 1,000 different types: religious, moral, serious, futile, very general, very limited, immensely large, and very minute. As soon as several Americans have conceived a sentiment or an idea they want to produce before the world, they seek each other out, and when found, they unite. This is still true. Some 200 years later, by now the library staff in Bend is represented by more than 60 community groups, from the Chamber of Commerce to the City Club to the Homeless Leadership Coalition. The library system had made about 20 formal partnerships and countless informal ones. For example, working together with the library, the AARP helps with tax assistance. The Goodwill teaches resume writing classes. In its diverse offerings, the Bend Library is one example of many we saw around the country. Librarians are figuring out the best ways to be relevant or interesting to their communities. There's a long list of the sorts of popular offerings you'll find everywhere. Arts exhibits, book clubs, readings, computer classes, story hours. I've practiced yoga and sipped lattes in libraries all around the country. In Washington, D.C., I watched 75 people dancing the tango in the big entry hall of the Martin Luther King Library. Libraries offer citizenship classes, English language classes, and programs on car seat safety, self-defense, parenting, and in Bend, fighting forest fires. Local lending libraries have inventive place-based programs. In Denver, you can borrow hiking equipment and maps from the public library before heading out to the mountains. In Vermilion, Ohio, my hometown on Lake Erie, you can borrow a fishing pole from the kids section. In gardening crazy Duluth, you can borrow seeds for your garden, your home plot, but then replace them when your crop yields. In Burlington, Vermont, the summer season yields tools available for borrowing hose, rakes, shovels, and barrels of tennis rackets. In the winter, they swapped for snow shovels, which librarians told me were popular with ambitious youngsters who wanted to borrow them on snowy weekends to earn some money clearing sidewalks. You can watch movies in the newly plush basement theater of the former vault of the former bank that is now the Kansas City Public Library. During the Minnesota summers, you can paddle your boat out into the floating library in one of the many Minneapolis-St. Paul lakes and take your books home in a watertight bag. I'm going to stop right there because I could go on forever and ever about the various creative opportunities that librarians have, but that's it for the moment.
Thanks, Deb. Our next speaker is James Fallows. James Fallows has been a longtime writer for the Atlantic magazine. He has reported from around the world since late 1970s, including extended assignments in China, Japan, and Southeast Asia, and within the United States in Texas, Washington State, and California. He has written 12 books and won the American Book Award, the National Magazine Award, and a documentary Emmy. He has also done extensive commentary on National Public Radio. He now hosts a Substack site called Breaking the News. For the past several years, he and his wife, the writer Deborah Fallows, has been traveling through smaller town America and reporting on innovations of all sorts. James Fallows grew up in Redlands, California, studied American history and literature at Harvard, studied economics at Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar, and once worked in the White House as Jimmy Carter's chief speechwriter. He was recently elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He is licensed, and he is a licensed instrument-rated pilot. Please welcome to the screen, James Fallows. Let me snag you here. There you go.
So Alice, thank you so much. Your attendees may recognize it's the same set where Deb was, and she is off to the side, and I'm here. It's such a pleasure to join you. And also, as Deb said, Roger and Jenny Rosenblatt were original mentors of us decades ago. So we're so honored to join this series. We've been listening in through the whole sequence of them too. So Deb was telling you about some of the things we learned about the refugee absorption in places like Sioux Falls, and also about the roles of libraries all around the country. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the beginning of this journey, why we did what we were doing, and then a brief excerpt from the end. And the background of what I'm going to read for the setup is that Deb and I have been living for a number of years in China. Then we came back to the US and we're trying to do a reporting project here, and here is how we set it up. We began this project with one purpose in mind. We wanted to take a fresh look at the country, its disappointments and its possibilities. We ended up wondering about questions and trends that were very different from what we'd expected, and with a story to tell that we could barely have imagined when we were setting out. By the end of the journey, we felt sure of something we had suspected at the beginning, that an important part of the face of modern America has slipped from people's view in a way that makes a big and destructive difference in the country's public and economic life. Despite the economic crises of the preceding decade and the social tensions of which every American is aware, we found that most parts of America that we visited have been doing better in most ways than most Americans realize. This is a sentence with three mosts in it, and that is for intentionally and for emphasis of just trying to put things in proportion. Because many people don't know that, they're inclined to view any local problems as symptoms of wider disasters and to dismiss local successes as fortunate anomalies. They feel even angrier about the country's challenges than they should, and more fatalistic about the prospects of dealing with them. We wanted to look at parts of the country generally missed by the media spotlight. That would mean reporting on the places often considered as flyover country. Such cities, medium-sized or below, and rural areas usually made their way to national attention only after a tornado or a mass shooting, during presidential campaign season, or as backdrops for concept pieces like the Private Prison Revolution or After Coal, What? We were interested in places that had faced adversity of some sort, from crop failure to job loss to political crisis, and that had looked for ways to respond. Since the late 1990s, Deb and I had flown at low altitudes in little single-engine four-seat propeller planes across the country, seeing the sorts of landscapes, communities, and cultures that can be hard to reach otherwise. Once we stopped unexpectedly in Red Oak, Iowa, a tiny farming center usually neglected even during the saturation coverage every 4 years of the Iowa caucuses. There we learned about an enclave of Central American immigrants who had set up successful operations in what would usually be considered a classically insular, non-diverse part of America. And I go on to talk about what we saw in Red Oak and we saw in Rock Springs, Wyoming, and I'm skipping ahead a little bit more to the setup, talking about the whole idea of traveling in a little plane. There is a high-toned tradition of road trips as a means of discovering America. From Lewis and Clark and Tocqueville through John Dos Passos, John Steinbeck, and William Least Heat Moon. Apart from other obvious points of contrast, our project is different from that, rather than rather than going by car or wagon or pirogue, we've been going from city to city in our family's small single-engine propeller plane, a Cirrus SR-22. This was a decision made for convenience, for beauty, and for edification. The convenience comes from the simple fact that almost any settlement in America is within close range of a place where a small airplane can land. Some 5,000 public landing facilities, many of them built for military purposes during and after World War II, are scattered all about the United States, making many remote hamlets more easily reachable by air than by other means. The beauty comes from the unending fascination of watching the American landscape unfurl below you as you travel at low altitude. At the dawn of powered flight a century ago, it was assumed that writers and painters and poets would want to become aviators and vice versa. Charles Lindbergh, Amelia Earhart, and Ernest K. Gann were flyers who wrote. Beryl Markham, Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, and Anne-Marie Lindbergh were writers who flew because of the unique perspective on civilization and nature offered by the aerial view. The late novelist James Salter, who was a Korean War fighter pilot and retained his passion for flight, was a mid-century example. William Langewish, a longtime book and magazine writer and a friend of ours, and the son of Wolfgang Langewish, whose Stick and Rudder is the flying world's equivalent of the Elements of Style, is a recent example. Mark van Honecker, a 747 pilot who writes about flight with extraordinary elegance in his recent book Skyfaring, is yet another. From ground level, America is mainly road. After all, that's where cars can take you. From the sky, America is mainly forest in the eastern third, farmland in the middle, then mountain and desert in the west, before the strip of intense development along the California coast. It's also full of features obvious from the sky that are much harder to notice from the ground and are difficult to pick out from 6 miles up in an airliner. Some of the most striking are quarries at the edge of most towns to provide gravel for roads and construction sites, or prisons instantly identifiable by their fencing, although some mega high schools can look similar, usually miles from the nearest town or tucked into locations where normal ground-based traffic won't pass by, and the vast sea of parking lot spaces surrounding shopping malls on the edges of town. We never tire of the view of this from this height, as different from the normal grim airliner perspective as scuba diving is from traveling on a container ship. The edification comes from lessons in history, geography, urban planning, and environmental protection and despoilation that are inescapably obvious from above. Why is St. Louis where it is? Of course, it's where the Missouri and Mississippi rivers come together. Why were mill towns built along the fall line of the Appalachians? Because of the long north to south sequence of waterfalls. As you cross South Dakota from the big city, from east to west, from the big city of Sioux Falls at the Iowa and Minnesota borders towards Rapid City and the Black Hills and beyond, you can see the terrain change sharply. In the East River portion of the state, between Sioux Falls and the Missouri, you see flat, well-watered farmlands and small farming towns. Then past Pierre, you reach West River, with rough, dry badlands, some grazing cattle, and very few structures. Everyone who has looked at a map knows about the effect of topography and rainfall, but it means something different as it unfolds below you like a real-world Google Earth. You can also see the history of transportation and the way towns are settled. Even in South Dakota's fertile East River area, you can easily trace from low altitude what the railroads ushered in 150 years ago and how their impact has ebbed. As we flew along one of the East Coast lines that brought settlers into these territories and carried crops out to markets, we would see little settlements every few minutes of air travel. In the 1800s, they were set up at roughly 10-mile intervals, an efficient distance then when farmers were delivering their harvest by wagon. Now that it seems that 4 out of 5 of those little towns are withering, as farms are run with giant combines and crops are hauled out by truck. With each city we visited and each stop we made, the list of future places we hope to learn about only grew. But as the months and years went on, we developed a picture of on-the-ground realities different from what we had assumed when the journey began. And that was the setup to telling about a number of the stories. Now I'm going to read very briefly something from the end of the book. And the setup here is after we've been to 50 cities or so, written at length, about 25 of them, talking about how the resilience and inventiveness in many smaller towns was an offset to a lot of what we're seeing as paralysis on the local level. And I'm setting up in the end of the book a contrast between a comparison between the Gilded Age we're part of right now, with the economic inequalities and the new technology and the dislocation and the strains in politics, and the original Gilded Age of the late 1800s and early 1900s led to the Age of Reform. And so I'm drawing out this comparison, and I end this way. I said, talk about how there is this local level of inventiveness. When the national mood after the first Gilded Age favored reform, possibilities that had been tested, refined, and made to work in various laboratories of democracy were at hand. After our current Gilded Age, someday the national mood will inevitably change again. When it does, a new set of ideas and plans will be at hand. We've seen them being tested in towns we never would have suspected, by people who would never join forces in the national capital, but who find ways to work together back home. Their projects, the progress they have made, and their goals are more congruent than even they might imagine. And until the country's mood does change, the people who have been reweaving the national fabric will be more effective if they realize how many other people are working towards a similar end. I thought frequently of what Philip Zelikow, a professor at the University of Virginia, said to us at the beginning of our travels. He said, "In scores of ways, Americans are figuring out how to take advantage of the opportunities of this era, often through bypassing or ignoring the dismal national conversation and prospect. There are more positive narratives out there, but they're lonely and disconnected. It would make a difference to join them together as a chorus that has a melody." That's what I quote from Philip Zelikow, and then end by saying, "This is the American song we have heard." So that is the setup for what Deb and I have seen. We'll do a bit of stage business now, where Deb is going to come over from the side, and we will be joining together. And I have some questions to ask for Deb. Would you join me here?
Yeah.
Why don't you sit there?
Okay, here we go.
So until Alice interrupts us with questions, I'm going to actually ask Deb some questions, which is my long desire to do that since I really got a chance. So we spent most of the year before the pandemic filming a movie, and it came out last year. What did you learn by becoming a movie star?
Yeah, we were the quote talent. Fortunately, we weren't on screen that much. It was quite an amazing experience. We worked with a really wonderful filmmaker couple, Jeannie Jordan and Steve Asher, who are from Boston, and we had been matched up with them, and it was this perfect matchmaking. They are a married couple like we are, and had worked together a long time like we had, and we worked very closely with them, deciding what the themes of the film should be, what the arc of the film should be, which towns we should choose, which we did for geography and size and themes. And then we went out and hit the road with a very small film crew. There were just a couple other people along with us, a lot of equipment. We were on the road for filming for 100 days, which was a very long time, from way before dawn till way after dark. And I think a couple of the things that we learned that impressed us the most were the way you look at the world and describe what you see. You know, for us, especially if you're writing on the internet, this is a big, thick book. You can write as many words as you want about what you're seeing. But in film, with that 100 days boiled down to 97 minutes, every single frame, every pixel had to be captured exactly at the right moment, no second chances, with the right expression, to say much more than just that instant was. So I think watching them practice their craft in such a creative, urgent, thoughtful way was something that was what was really exciting for us, and we had great admiration for what they did and felt like they portrayed the book perfectly with their. We wouldn't have changed a thing, honestly. It was just amazing. The only thing we would change is to sweep a lot of that stuff up from the edit room floor that we so heartbreakingly had to lose because of timing.
That's all HBO's property.
That's right. Yeah. So, right. Even worse.
So can I make a writing point about the film?
Yeah.
So since this is a Write America session, and since Roger was once one of my actual professors in a writing class, I can make this point, which is that it was very interesting to see the different registers of writing that went into this filmmaking. So as Alice mentioned, I once worked as a speechwriter back in the Jimmy Carter days, and there's a real difference in writing that is to be heard in a speech versus what you're going to have on the page, because when you're writing to be heard for a broadcast or a speech, really people only keep the previous 15 or 20 seconds in mind as they're hearing it. And when you're writing on the page, you can assume they can look back at it, but it's much more real time when you're doing something to be heard. And so there's a sequence from writing a book where you can sort of lay out things in detail, writing shorter pieces, magazine articles or blog posts, writing anything to be heard, like radio commentaries or speeches, and then writing for a movie where we were working with Steve Asher and Jeannie Jordan and doing the voiceover for this, and the haiku-like compression of almost everything we had to say, and realizing that this was the most dramatic illustration of a picture in a movie frame is worth a million words. We could have 3 or 4 words of text with a 10-second cut of a cowboy outside Bend, Oregon, or a bayou in Mississippi, Louisiana. And that was really interesting to me, of the different levels of writing compression, like a graphite being squeezed from pencil lead to to a gem. We felt like the squeezed graphite,
We
right?
did,
But it came up with gem-like features.
Sometimes.
So, go ahead. Your turn. Yes.
Can I ask you a question?
Yes.
All right. So one of the questions that people ask us most frequently, and I'm going to ask again to Jim. So we sound very positive about the country, about what we've seen, about the collaborations, about the resiliency, about the creativity on many levels in the small towns. And people say, how do you reconcile this with what we hear and know all the time about the divisions and the bitterness across the land? And you have, I think, a pretty good answer for that, or have at least thought about it a lot.
I have a list of little answers. Shall I address you, or shall I address the camera?
You can address the audience.
I will address the audience and the little green light. So we were doing a lot of our traveling. Most of the places we went voted Republican in the 2016 election, and we were traveling right through the end of 2016. And so the question was, how could places that we wrote about and believed to be welcoming to people of different backgrounds and being interested in collaboration, why were they voting for a different policy at the national level than that? And here are the range of answers I will give, and we can discuss them later. You can challenge me, or the group can too. One is, national politics, it seemed to us, was becoming more and more just abstract, tribal, religious, and separated from anything that's in real life. That it was like a toxic version of sporting loyalties or religious identities. You're a Yankee or Red Sox fan, and you just don't like the people who are in the other camp. I grew up in Southern California. You were for the Dodgers or for the San Francisco Giants, and there's a way in which national politics has become tribal like that, and resentment driven in a way that doesn't reflect necessarily that much of the national of the local sentiments. Shall I tell the Dodge City voting story?
Sure.
So
yeah.
I don't know if any of you have been to Dodge City, Kansas. We spent a fair amount of time there. Those of you, if any of you are boomer era people like Deb and me, you might recall Gunsmoke from the old days of TV. And so Dodge City was where that was set. There's still a downtown stage with a Long Branch Saloon and all the rest, where they have tourists mainly from Germany, because Gunsmoke is still shown in Germany these days. But Dodge City is now a mainly Latino community because of the meatpacking industry there, like much of Western Kansas. And we spent a lot of time there and heard from both Latino and white leaders in Dodge City about how the city recognized this was their future. The schools are very actively bilingual, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a story right, I think, the time of the 2016 elections about Dodge City having moved the only polling place way out of downtown and away from where all the Latino population was. So we called up our friends in Dodge City and said, what's the deal here? We thought this was not the way the city was going. And what they told us, both the white and Latino leaders, is that this was a state government measure you'll remember Chris Kobach was then the Secretary of State from Kansas, and this was part of his voting efforts. And that the city council of Dodge City, which was then, I think, almost all older white people, they passed a resolution the next day, number one, offering free transportation to the polling places to any person in Dodge City who wanted it. And also having some proclamation about how Dodge City is, we recognize that this is our inclusive Dodge City. And they put out that proclamation from the white city council in English and in Spanish, both. The point, to skip ahead to one other point here, Obviously, we think there is a battle for the soul of America right now between the national level poison we are all aware of and local level offsets to that. And the question is where the frontier between those two things evolves. And we think that everybody is, if both of those things exist in the national narrative now, what we know about is 95% the poison, and at least being aware of the antidote is valuable. So, are there other answers I should give you on that?
No, but I want to just butt in and ask you one more question. So we were on the road starting in 2013 for 5 years, nearly, a really long time. We wrote all these blog posts. We wrote the book. We thought we could stop and go on. We could either go on forever or we could just stop. So we decided to stop and write the book. And then it turned into a movie. And then the pandemic came. And then we thought, well, what do we do now? What do we do with all this now? Because we could either go back on the road, which didn't seem right, or we could do what?
So we've started a little foundation called the Our Town Civic Foundation. If you look up ourtownsfoundation.org, you'll see our site that has two goals based on our journalistic experience. One is simply to provide some leverage in the national journalistic awareness. It's still the case that when national media outlets are going to cover something from Kansas or Louisiana or Idaho, they often will just go to a diner and start out asking people, how do you feel about national politics and things that are most divisive? And so we're trying to sponsor journalistic voices from around the country, just making people more aware of this other part of the national narrative, which is part of our story now, and figuring we have some leverage in mainstream journalism to get some mileage here. The other thing we're trying to do is to connect people who are doing these things around the country and not aware of each other's existence. People in Fresno who are doing things like people in Pensacola. I skipped over a paragraph in the end of the book where my college classmate, Michael Kazin, you will know him as a distinguished American historian now. He often writes about the progressive era and the populist era and the way that there were all these informal networks of people learning from one another. And we're trying to do those two things to affect the national journalistic narrative and to provide more connections. Correct.
That's right. It sounds very high-minded. Every day we're just kind of like digging in this gravel, trying to make little hills make it into something. But, that's how it works.
So I'm going to ask you, Deb, you are a girl of small town Ohio. What was the main thing you learned about our nation during our travels?
I think I learned, well, first of all, it surprised me at how comfortable we were going to small towns and how easy it was to talk to people. If you ask them the questions, what's going on in your town, people are actually flattered and happy to talk to you honestly, in depth, about what is on the issues on their mind. We never asked about, what do you think about Hillary? What do you think about Trump? How's Obama doing? We avoided the national topics because we knew we wouldn't get interesting answers there. I think that Americans are really proud of their country and really proud of the towns that they live in, and that they have agency to act and make those towns better.
One of the things which has kept us together over the decades is, you'll notice I have a sentence which uses the word most about 10 times. And Deb likes to say, Americans do this and people do that and towns are this way, right? This is our yin and yang.
Yes, a lot of yin yang going on. But, it makes it interesting. I have something to add to that question. When we were in China, we would go our separate ways during the day out, doing what we were doing, seeing what we were seeing. Every day we would come home to dinner and say to each other, you'll never believe what I saw today. You'll never believe what I heard today. And maybe one of the most surprising things, having grown up as an American in small town America, was how we did the same thing on the road, and we came back to dinner every day saying the same thing. You'll never believe what I learned today or what I saw today in this small town. So you can make big of that or make little of that, but it was amazing at how much we learned that we didn't know before.
Can I make a linguistics point and then sort of my Noam Chomsky point?
If you dare, yeah.
I dare. So Deb is a PhD linguist, so I tread lightly here, and she speaks like a whole zillion languages. And every single language, Japanese, Malay, German, Swedish, people say to Deb, "Oh, you sound so great." Nobody ever says that to me in any language. But this is the linguistic triple whammy here is that when Deb was a linguistic undergrad, Noam Chomsky was then in his prime at MIT before he got involved in political things. And something that I hadn't realized is Noam Chomsky is a big sports talk radio buff. And he wrote a piece maybe 10 years ago or so, which really resonated with me, saying that it should be possible to have Americans talk about public life with as much sophistication as they do on sports talk radio. Because if you listen to sports talk radio, say, well, Belichick made this, wrong call on this trade, and the Yankees are doing this, and blah, 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 and people are sophisticated, whereas most public discussion of national politics is just reductionist, and it's all like cable news. And the version of Noam Chomsky's America we heard is, if you ask people about national politics, they sound dumb and biased. If you ask them about their lives and their communities, people are smart. And they're all the centers of their own narratives, and their communities are the center. And they're thinking about, will their children come back, how it's different from their grandparents, what's good and what's bad. People are smart, and being able to approach them on areas where they are sophisticated and the experts was lots of fun. That's my linguistics point.
Okay, that's all right. That's fair.
I recommend Deb's book, Dreaming in Chinese. And
okay. So I want to ask a question. Everyone has about the pandemic, because everybody's had a huge experience during the pandemic. What did you learn about, from anything related to what we're talking about, life in America, life on the road, life at home, life in small towns, from the years in the pandemic that we've been at home?
So I learned something about us and about me.
Okay.
So the about us is that we had been on the road nonstop for decades. We've lived outside the U.S. a lot. We've always been traveling, and we had basically 2 years where it was just the two of us. And so I was
two
feeling
very happy years.
Yes, and so I was feeling I was glad that after having been married now for 50 years that I was really glad to be able just to, we are fortunate in many ways. We didn't get sick. We all the others, we are in the most, privileged position, but I was glad that this was a reinforcing rather than separating thing about me, made me recognize that the reason I love being a reporter, which is basically the only job I ever had, is the joy of showing up and seeing what you learn that you didn't know until you showed up places. For the last 2 years, we haven't been able to show up any place.
Yeah.
And that has been really phantom limb pain for me, of just, the joy of being able to walk down the street, see a vista, talk to a person saying what's going on here. The fact that we couldn't do that, I missed that more than I expected.
Mm-hmm.
And so so Alice, I'm going to ask you, should we keep going, or do you have any questions? Should we give you
That's the cue I was waiting for. I do have a couple of questions. You guys need to get a little. There you go.
There we go.
That's so lovely.
So cute.
It's so cute, right?
Almost, yeah. There's a question from Laura, and it's, as an American of enslaved African ancestry, it's hard to buy into your enthusiasm. How do you think the original sin changes the scope of your travels? Asylum said you went to mostly white communities, so I figured I would just ask that right out.
Yeah, sure. And it's so we went. The second half of our book is increasingly about places that. So the first few places we went were more white than not, but we spent a lot of time in Mississippi, and we spent a lot of time. I grew up in Redlands, California, next to San Bernardino. San Bernardino was one of our cities too, and that is a probably 30% white town, probably majority Latino, black, white, et cetera. And we were in South Carolina to a great degree. So the first point, of course, is that all of American history turns on the axis of the centuries of enslavement. And this is the central fact of American history. And it's something that in many of the communities we went to, they were dealing with that. A lot of the places we chronicled how the unchangeable fact of the centuries of American history is now reckoned in 21st century life. The two places I will mention right now, one is Duluth, Minnesota, which was the site of the northernmost lynching in the United States. It was 1920. It was just before the Tulsa Race Massacre. And the way in which for decades that was concealed by the mainly white and somewhat Latin Native American population of Duluth. But over the last 20 years, they have what is the major public monument in downtown Duluth is a more than life-size statue of the three men who were murdered and their stories and their et cetera, trying to reckon with this. The other was in Columbus, Mississippi, the site of the Mississippi School of Mathematics and Science, which is a public school.
No, I'm just
okay.
going out of
Okay, I'm going out of the so I was trying to keep social distancing.
No.
Where it's a public school for high school students from Mississippi. It's mixed race like Mississippi itself is, and they have for the last 10 years have an increasingly popular in Mississippi and around the country, an attention-getting set of living reenactments of the history of the town through the Civil War era and Reconstruction and Jim Crow and the early 20th century, where we have in our movie a long scene of the black and white students of the Mississippi School of Mathematics and Science rendering the history of their town. So there is no way that any of us can change the history of the United States, but we tried to talk about the ways in which communities were reckoning with this history or trying to at least confront it.
The next question I have here is also, did you venture into any sundown towns?
There were some that were, I think, that would have been by definition so we spent a lot of time in Greenville, South Carolina, with the black and white residents of Greenville, and the way in which they've had their public statuary has tried to recognize the civil rights history of Greenville. And so Greenville, South Carolina, I believe would have been in that category. Certainly all the places we're in Mississippi would have been. We've been in Indiana, but not for this book, and also in Oklahoma. So we have been in places that would have been sundown towns. None of them, to our knowledge, obviously were anymore, but a constant motif of the book was how communities were dealing with their history of black-white race relations, Native American race relations, and Latino race relations, especially in the West.
Before your trip, I'm assuming, and I could be completely wrong, did you pick every place you were going to stop, or did you serendipitously add places? I mean, tell us about that process of how you made some of those choices, and were some of them spontaneous, or just a little bit about that?
Yeah. The process started out is, let's go to a couple towns and see what we see. We really thought we would do this for 3 weeks or 2 months. And we started in the Midwest because we just happened to know some people who welcomed us and we thought could help us learn about their towns in Michigan and in South Dakota. And then it just quickly became so interesting that we thought, well, let's continue this. So we were just flying east. We went to Burlington, Vermont, and then we went up to Maine. And we thought, okay, let's just go down the East Coast. So we spent a long time in Greenville, South Carolina. And I think it was about that time that our trajectory changed. We thought we had enough that we wanted to keep going quite a long time. And we should circle around the country, following the good weather, because we were in this little plane, and I tell you, it's a lot easier to travel and spend time when it's warmer weather. So we spent some winter months in the South. a lot of it was serendipitous. When we were in Greenville, South Carolina, we were writing about this governor's school for arts and humanities and going on and on about it. And one day in my inbox came this message from a teacher in Mississippi named Thomas Easterling, who basically said, "You think that governor's school is so great, you got to come see ours in Mississippi." So we thought, okay, we'll go to Mississippi. And that started the Southern tour. Then we kind of went geographically around the country.
And intentionally down market for places that were sort of having worse and worse problems.
That's true. We
like
hit
Erie,
Charleston, West Virginia, not South Carolina. San Bernardino, we spent a long time. We wanted to
Fresno.
get Fresno. We wanted to get some big towns and some little towns. Big towns like Columbus, Ohio, and Pittsburgh were the two biggest, just to see what we would find was different and what kind of theories that we had come up with, if those worked in big towns too. So, toward the end, we kind of did it geographically, thinking, gosh, we haven't been to the West Coast enough. So we went up north to Oregon and then across Montana. There was a problem in the very center of the country, which is called the Rocky Mountains, because our little plane, once we crossed the Rockies and swore we would never do that again. It was just too high and too...
the air was too thin?
Yes, it is.
Too dangerous.
Yes, it's not
I
made
live there. I get it.
For little airplanes. And can I just circle back with a very brief addition to the sort of racial reckoning theme? And if any of you look up my name, James Fallows, and Pensacola and the Klan, you'll find a report we did recently about an extraordinary racial reckoning in the city of Pensacola, which had been where they discovered that the most prominent citizen of early 1900s Pensacola had also been the exalted Cyclops of the Klan. And the way that his white family and all the Black institutions of Pensacola were coming together to reckon with this horrible discovery. So anyhow, that's worth...
No, thank you for mentioning that. It's definitely in context. Thank you. What could you explain just a little bit about your writing process? I mean, did you journal as you went along? Did you write? Did you take a computer? Did you just remember it all? I mean, how did you deal with that part of it? Because that's a lot of information.
It's a lot of information. We took notes and used tape recorders every day. Mm-hmm. And back in Motel 6 every night, we transcribed things and wrote it all down, and then wrote short posts for the Atlantic as we went. It was a constant look right. It was clear that we could never possibly remember all of this unless we did it as we went. And we never, as you can tell, we cover really different things. We're yin-yang people. And we did it very differently. I think we never looked at each other's stuff. And the book is divvied up into Deb, Jim in our own voices and in our own topics. So it wasn't, we would not be here sitting next to each other today if we had sat next to each other and tried to write together a book. No.
Well, I'm a big believer of write it down each day, that night, write down what happened that night.
I figured it had to be because it's so extensive, and the depth to which you've gone into this can't be just brought up. You can tell the stories, but the depth of it is too extensive. I have one question left because we are at the end. Yeah. What are you reading now? I'm a bookstore owner. Yeah. I always have to ask that question. What are you reading now?
Okay. I have it. This is going to be a twofer. It is, what am I reading and who's a new writer to recommend? This is a book by Orville Schell, who is a longtime writer, but a first-time novelist. He has written extensively about China. It's called My Old Home. And it is this incredibly in-depth, epic novel about life in China during the Cultural Revolution. It evokes everything of most everything of what most people in China told us about their experiences during the Cultural Revolution, which were not just plain and simple. I went to the countryside, but I learned to be a leader in the countryside, or here's what I suffered in the countryside, or I can't really tell you about the countryside and the Cultural Revolution. It's like watching, it's kind of like when we were watching the film being made, that every pixel, every word in this very fat novel speaks of the Chinese experience. And I'm so proud of Orville in this book. Yeah.
And could you repeat his name?
Orville Schell, Schell.
And
Thank
he's
you.
written a number of nonfiction books about China. This is his first novel, and it's really wonderful.
I'm writing as you speak. Jim, what are you reading?
Here's a book I've just started. It's called The Bright Ages by two history
Oh, yeah.
professors.
Mhm.
It's where David Perry and Matthew Gabrielli, I don't know how he says the last name. It's a theme of enduring interest to me of what happened after the fall of the Roman Empire and how we should think about, that the Middle Ages, the Dark Ages, the Bright Ages, et cetera. So I've just started this, but but I'm hearing lots of good things about it. So that I recommend that to all of you.
Yeah, our history book group was all over that one. So yeah, they kind of discovered it. But they also like big books. So I like the other suggestion that you made. Folks, I'm sorry that we're out of town. I do have to sign off and say goodnight. It has been a rare and precious experience being here and hearing all that you had to share. And so I'm going to sign off and say thank you to Deborah and James for participating in Right America this evening, to everyone who tuned in tonight. And thank you particularly to Roger Rosenblatt for creating this original and important series to look forward to each and every Monday evening. Tonight's episode is the perfect example of the purpose and mission of Right America. We hope to see you next Monday at 7 as we welcome Rose Styron, Philip Schultz, and Marilyn Nelson. Please remember to check out Bird's Book's Right America page where you can sign up for upcoming episodes and maybe purchase a book or two. Thank you and have a great evening.